This letter not only uses language about government in Pretoria, calling it, for example, an ethno-nationalist gangster regime, it suggests that the conduct of government led by President Cyril Ramaphosa means that South Africa is no longer committed to the protection of private property rights, and as such, that, they say, is a violation of the US federal criminal code, which means that South Africa would be on its merits ineligible for AGOA renewal because it...
Guys, so the way I see this whole thing, it's really putting South Africa in a really difficult place. Should South Africa now go begging or asking for forgiveness? Or this is actually some of the things that makes me really confused about geopolitics. So it appears now that the US, actually these senators and all of these guys who are actually kind of like really pushing South Africa's AGOA kind of like permit should actually be cut. They're really serious about this. And this this news reporter here, I think from Newsroom, is actually giving real details on how the whole thing has been building up, and it almost appears as though that, you know, the South African embassy in the US, I think some of the officials, they have even been trying to reach out, but these guys do not want to give them an ear. And so we know that President Ramaphosa seems to want to send some delegates from South Africa to the US to try to meet and try to really start negotiations. But, you know, this reporter is even arguing that, you know, it might actually be tricky because it appears that the US doesn't even want to give a correspondent, so to speak, to South African delegates because they are considering to cut diplomatic ties with South Africa. So this is how serious this whole thing has gotten. And for South Africa to have its, you know, position in the world, you know, at a place where it's on the blacklist in the US of the US foreign policy, I think it's really a really scary place to be because, you know, during my PhD study, I studied about, you know, there was a president in Ghana called Jerry Rawlings. When he appeared on the scene, you know, it was actually in a revolutionary era during Ghana's December 31st revolution. It actually started on June 4th, but now transcended into December 31st. And, you know, Ronald Reagan, I think, was president at that time. And he really, you know, started slowly seeing the anti-imperialist kind of like discourse taking place in Ghana at the time. And, you know, the research said that Ghana was actually on a special list, so to speak, in US foreign policy. And before later, I think Jerry Rawlings started building relationship with the US and all that. So I really don't know how this whole thing now will take, because South Africa really now has a really special place in US foreign policy. And that place is really, I think, not on the good side of things from the US perspective, because I think the US is, South Africa's taking Israel to the ICJ, International Criminal Court of Justice. Their relationship allegedly, I know Rob Hessoff speaks about it a lot, but close ties with Iran, close ties with I think China as well also seems to be kind of like the things that the US, these senators actually outlined that South Africa has been constantly violating the requirements to maintain its AGOA kind of like right, so to speak, to have tariff-free access into the US market. And so as a result of that violation, it actually says here in this video that it's the letter that was penned by these 4 senators to kick South Africa out of AGOA said that South Africa was violating US federal criminal code. That was how serious this whole thing is. And to kick AGOA, to kick South Africa out of AGOA, many people actually speak about, you know, the number of jobs that, for me, what I fear the most is, you know, because South Africa already has a really high unemployment rate, all right, really high, okay? Now to really take out these avenues that still keep people in jobs and working, I think that's really strange and detrimental. And if the BRICS countries will not be filling in that gap, I saw Donald Trump yesterday actually slamming Joe Biden's USAID funding programs, where I think he said that they were funding circumcision in Mozambique, voter turnout in India, some kind of like what he thinks were ridiculous use of taxpayers' money for USAID. And so as a result of that, you know, USAID had to really kind of like be caught and all that. And based on this, we saw India's Prime Minister Modi making a visit to the United States to kind of like ascertain or show its relationship with the US. And so my problem now is, Gaten McKenzie also said is that India is friends with the US and also friends with BRICS. Okay, so I'm really hoping and praying and really that BRICS and the BRICS countries will be able to fill in this gap that is being extracted from the US in terms of funding and aid without being an enemy to the United States. Okay, so if for example, if the PEPFAR funding or these other fundings can actually be substituted by Indian aid and not become an enemy of United States, because United States would blacklist South Africa from its diplomatic ties, then that would be really tricky, because then where would South Africa get the help it needs? Or probably, hopefully, China will step in fully, vociferously, and then I really don't know. These are scenarios that really scare me. But anyway, let's quickly listen to this news report. I think is a newsroom representative in the US, giving details on how this letter came to be and why the US is now considering to cut South Africa off from its AGOA ties and its AGOA rights into US market. And share your thoughts. Let's have a conversation in the comments.
Meanwhile, a group of congressmen in the United States have written a letter to President Donald Trump calling on him to revoke South Africa's preference benefits under AGOA. The congressmen people say this is due to what they say are human rights abuses and South Africa's continued insistence to undermine American security and foreign policy interests. For more on this letter and what it means for the future of South Africa's participation in AGOA, I'm joined by Simon Marks, our United States correspondent. Very good afternoon to you, Simon. Thank you very much for your time. Well, AGOA is key, to South Africa's trade relationship with the United States. The fact, though, is that the threats of revoking South Africa's AGOA membership precede Donald Trump's re-election.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Vuyo. There has been hostility towards South Africa among some elements in the United States Congress, and some have been arguing for successive American governments to take a look at South Africa's participation in AGOA. But look, it's a new day here now in the United States, and it is clearly a new dawn in the US-South African bilateral relationship. And the language used in this letter from these four members of Congress to President Donald Trump is extraordinary. This letter was scribed a week ago. It was only released within the last couple of days, so we don't quite understand the gap between the date on the letter, February the 11th, and the date on the public realization that it had been sent. But even the opening line, "The golden age of America has begun," they write. "In a matter of weeks, Mr. President, you have rejuvenated the American spirit." It certainly sounds like this is a letter designed for an audience of one, really, the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And possibly even, I think one has to wonder whether it was written at the behest of either the White House or some of those influential voices that have been whispering into Donald Trump's ear about the situation in South Africa, and particularly the Expropriation Act. And we should remind viewers that both the White House, the President himself, and the Secretary of State Marco Rubio have misstated what is actually taking place in South Africa under the expropriation law. They say that land is being expropriated, that human rights abuses are being committed via that law, which of course is something that the government in South Africa and other groups very much counter and contradict. But it's also important to underscore that this letter not only uses language about government in Pretoria, calling it, for example, an ethno-nationalist gangster regime, it suggests that the conduct of government led by President Cyril Ramaphosa Ramaphosa means that South Africa is no longer committed to the protection of private property rights. And as such, that, they say, is a violation of the US Federal Criminal Code, which means that South Africa would be on its merits ineligible for AGOA renewal because it pierces the requirements for coming under the AGOA umbrella. But even more, I think, concerning from the government's perspective there is the threat that is contained in this letter to suspend diplomatic relations between the United States and South Africa. We would suggest that you consider suspending diplomatic ties, these members of Congress write to President Trump, unless the South African government is prepared to engage constructively with our own. As you know, South Africa's foreign minister says that the embassy here has been trying to engage constructively with the Trump administration over the past 10 days since the onslaught against South Africa first begun here, and they say they simply are getting nowhere, not currently able to secure any attention from senior officials within the Trump administration. But it's not just this letter about potentially pulling South Africa out from AGOA, it's also about the possible suspension of diplomatic ties.
Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa has said he is going to send ministers to address the U.S.'s concerns. Do you think they are going to get a receptive audience there?
Well, that's the key question. I mean, the only point of sending ministers is when you know that those ministers are going to be welcomed into meetings. I mean, it would be, I think, futile to come here and not secure meetings with top officials, including potentially the country's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, both of whom, of course, today have their hands full in Saudi Arabia with the conversations that they've been having with Russian emissaries ahead of possible peace talks relating to ending the conflict in Ukraine. I mean, clearly, if the Trump administration is not set to receive on this issue, but is only set to transmit, is not willing to meet South African officials in person here in Washington, D.C., that is going to get very, very complicated indeed. I also just want to underscore, Vuyo, the background to at least one of the figures who has signed this letter, Congressman Andy Ogles. He is the Republican member of Congress who is so pro-Donald Trump that on the first day of the Trump administration, after the inauguration last month, Andy Ogles submitted an effort to amend the United States Constitution in the House of Representatives so that Donald Trump would be allowed to serve, if he wants to, a third term in office. So these are absolutely dyed-in-the-wool supporters of Donald Trump and his Make America Great Again movement. And the language in this letter is so hostile towards Pretoria that one has to wonder whether there's been a response to this letter from President Trump and the White House and to what extent it actually reflects the viewpoints and policies now of the Trump administration, particularly as we head towards the G20 summit in South Africa in November. Remember that Marco Rubio was supposed to be heading to South Africa right around now for the foreign ministers' preparatory meeting, G20 foreign ministers meeting that's taking place there in a couple of days' time. He decided to boycott that event. Does all of that presage a wider boycott of G20 by the United States? These four members of Congress clearly think that diplomatic ties between the two governments should be suspended, which would be an absolutely astonishing development. It's not something that ever even occurred during the apartheid era.
There are people, of course, who believe that this is all a smokescreen. In reality, the United States is unhappy that South Africa took Israel to the International Court of Justice.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely cited in this letter as well. I mean, all of these assaults on South Africa by the White House, by the State Department, and now by these members of Congress is not only based on the Expropriation Act, it's based on South African foreign policy. It's based on taking Israel to the ICJ. It's based, according to these members of Congress, on the proximity that some supporters of Hamas have, they claim in this letter, even to maintaining organizational structures in South Africa. And of course, it's also based on the warmth of the relationship between Pretoria and Moscow, and the relationship between Pretoria and Beijing. They complain in this letter that government is trying to force Taiwan to withdraw its diplomatic representative office from Pretoria. So all of those issues are cited in this letter as a reason why they argue in their conclusion that South Africa is simply not deserving of duty-free access to the American market. I think it would be a mistake, based on everything that we've seen so far, to think that all of this is just posturing by Donald Trump and the people that support him. This Trump administration, unlike the one 8 years ago, this Trump administration is not being held back by people on the inside who can go to Donald Trump and say, look, you really don't just want to go out there and in front of the world's media announce that the United States is going to take over the Gaza Strip, for example. There's no one to hold him back from the instincts that he has. And if his instincts are those that are contained in this letter and shared with these 4 members of Congress, I think, there is no reason to think that there's anyone within Donald Trump's inner circle who is saying to him, you really sure you want to take South Africa on like this? Are you absolutely sure this is the way you want to go?
Simon Max, we shall see how this all pans out. Simon Max, our U.S. correspondent, on the back, of course, of that letter by 4 U.S. congressmen who are asking Donald Trump to revoke South Africa's access to the U.S. market via AGOA.